The air in the Mercy General Emergency Department was a thick cocktail of antiseptic, iron-rich blood, and the cloying sweetness of human fear. It was a constant, a smell that clung to the inside of your nostrils and lingered on your scrubs long after the shift ended. Nurse Ilara Vance moved through the managed chaos of this environment like a ghost, a pale, quiet figure of preternatural calm. Where other nurses scurried with frantic energy, their movements sharp and bird-like, Ilara's were a study in fluid economy. No motion was wasted. A turn of the wrist to check a saline drip, a pivot of the hips to move from a gurney to a supply cart, a subtle dip of her head to listen to a patient's shallow breathing. It was a ballet of efficiency honed over years of practice in this crucible of pain and panic. Her colleagues saw it as a kind of detached professionalism, an emotional armor necessary for survival. They were not entirely wrong, but they had no concept of the furnace in which that armor had been forged. She was of average height, with unassuming features that seemed designed to blend into the background. Her light brown hair was always pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face, often scrubbed clean of any makeup, was dominated by a pair of startlingly observant grey eyes. They were the eyes of a watchmaker, missing nothing, assessing everything with a quiet, analytical depth. The only feature that drew a second glance was a thin, silvery scar that traced the line of her left temple, disappearing into her hairline. When new residents asked, she would offer a small, dismissive shrug and a quiet murmur about a fender bender in her youth. It was a simple, believable lie that deflected further inquiry and allowed her to remain what she desperately wanted to be: invisible, ordinary, a healer in a place of breaking. The lie was a shield, just as her quiet demeanor was a fortress, walling off a past that slept within her like a dormant wolf. Tonight, the ER was a maelstrom. A 6-car pile-up on the interstate had flooded the bays with a tide of broken bodies and shrieking sirens. Ilara was assigned to Trauma Bay 1, the heart of the storm. As the paramedics wheeled in a young man, his leg bent at an unnatural angle and his breathing a ragged, wet sound, her mind processed the data with the speed of a supercomputer. She did not hear the panicked shouts of the interns or the frantic beeping of the monitors as noise. She heard it as information. Her hands moved with a purpose that bordered on clairvoyance, cutting away the blood-soaked denim, applying pressure to a femoral bleed, and calling out vitals in a low, steady voice that cut through the surrounding clamor like a blade. Systolic is dropping to 80. I need 2 units of O-neg now. And get Dr. Evans in here. We have a tension pneumothorax developing. Her diagnosis was flat, certain, delivered seconds before the monitor confirmed the patient's saturations were plummeting. It was this unnerving prescience, this ability to see the path of an injury 3 steps ahead, that earned her the quiet respect of the surgeons, even if it made the other nurses slightly wary. They saw competence. They could not see the countless hours she had spent on dusty floors in far-flung, God-forsaken places, making life-or-death decisions with nothing more than a field kit and the sheer force of her will. The doors to the ER swished open again, but this time it was not for another victim of the crash. A wave of cold, sterile authority washed into the room, personified by Mr. Gerald Davies, the hospital administrator. He was a man constructed of sharp angles and expensive fabric, his suit a stark, dark grey against the pale greens and whites of the medical staff. His shoes clicked with an irritatingly precise rhythm on the linoleum, a sound of money and impatience. He was flanked by 2 equally polished individuals, potential donors being given the grand tour. Davies's face was a mask of strained politeness, his eyes flitting over the scenes of frantic medical care with a look of profound distaste, as if the very act of saving lives was a messy, inconvenient business that sullied the pristine reputation of his institution. He saw bloodstains as a custodial issue and suffering as bad for public relations. "As you can see," Davies said, his voice a smooth, condescending balm, meant for his guests, but loud enough for the staff to hear, "we are a state-of-the-art facility, equipped to handle any crisis, though of course we prefer our days to be a bit more orderly." He gestured vaguely toward Ilara's bay, where she was now skillfully inserting a chest tube, the procedure swift and clean. He saw a nurse performing a messy task. He did not see the life being pulled back from the brink. His gaze fell upon Ilara's focused form, and a small frown of irritation creased his brow. To him, she was just part of the machinery, a cog he expected to run silently and without drawing undue attention. Suddenly, a priority call crackled over the charge nurse's radio, a burst of static and urgency that momentarily silenced the bay. "ETA 2 minutes, VIP inbound. Motorcade incident, single GSW to the upper torso, conscious but combative. Secure trauma bay 3. I repeat, this is a level 1 priority." The atmosphere in the ER shifted. The controlled chaos of the pile-up victims was one thing. A VIP with a gunshot wound was another. It meant security, protocols, and worst of all, oversight from people like Mr. Davies. As the staff scrambled to prepare Bay 3, Davies's eyes lit up with a perverse kind of excitement. This was not just a patient. This was a performance. The automatic doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and a phalanx of grim-faced men in dark suits preceded the gurney. On it lay a man in his late 60s, his face ashen but his eyes blazing with fury and pain. A makeshift pressure dressing on his shoulder was soaked a dark, alarming crimson. He was still wearing the tattered remains of a fine suit, and his voice, when he spoke, was a rasping bark of pure command. "Get your hands off me. I want the Chief of Surgery, not some intern. I am Rear Admiral Jonathan Croft of the United States Navy, and I will not be poked and prodded by amateurs." His pronouncements were punctuated by pained grunts, but his arrogance remained fully intact. Mr. Davies scurried forward, his face a rictus of fawning concern. "Admiral Croft, sir, you are in the best hands at Mercy General. We will have our top people with you momentarily." He turned, his eyes scanning the room, and landed on Ilara, who had just stabilized her patient from the car crash and was stripping off her bloody gloves. "You!" Davies snapped, pointing a manicured finger at her. "Get in there. Assist Dr. Ramirez, and for God's sake, look sharp. This is not some vagrant from a traffic accident." The insult was delivered with casual cruelty, a public assertion of his dominance and her insignificance. The comparison hung in the air, thick and ugly, branding her as a lesser-tier caregiver for lesser-tier people. Ilara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She met Davies's gaze for a brief second, her grey eyes flat and unreadable. She said nothing. She simply disposed of her gloves, washed her hands with the ritualistic precision she applied to everything, and walked toward Trauma Bay 3. The insult had landed, a small, sharp stone thrown against the wall of her fortress. It did not breach it, but it chipped the stone. She had heard worse, from men far more dangerous than this preening bureaucrat. But here, in this place, she had chosen for its peace, its anonymity. It felt different. It felt like a violation of a fragile truce she had made with the world. Inside Bay 3, Admiral Croft was continuing his tirade, batting away the hands of a young resident who was trying to get an IV started. "I said I want the Chief of Surgery. Is anyone in this godforsaken hospital competent?" Ilara moved to the opposite side of the gurney, her presence so quiet that the Admiral didn't notice her at first. She began her assessment without a word, her eyes cataloguing the wound, the pallor of his skin, the shallow, rapid rhythm of his breathing. Her hands were gentle but firm as she took his wrist to feel for a pulse. "And who the hell are you?" Croft snarled, his eyes finally swiveling to her. "Another nurse. I gave an order. I demand—" He stopped. His eyes, blazing with indignation a moment before, widened in disbelief. The torrent of words died in his throat, choked off by a sudden, profound shock. He stared at her face, his gaze fixed on the quiet woman with the observant grey eyes and the faint, silvery scar at her temple. The colour drained from his face, replaced by an expression of utter, dumbfounded recognition. The arrogant, demanding Admiral, the man who had bellowed his rank at everyone in the room, went completely, utterly silent. His mouth hung slightly open, as if he had been about to speak a name that had been buried under 2 decades of memory and trauma, a name that did not belong in this clean, bright, civilian place. Mr. Davies, who had followed Ilara into the bay to supervise, noticed the abrupt silence. He misinterpreted it as a sign of the Admiral's worsening condition. "What is it? What's wrong with him?" he asked, his voice shrill with panic. He looked from the monitor to the Admiral's stunned face, and then to Ilara. "What did you do?" he accused, his default assumption being that she, the lowly nurse, was somehow at fault. Ilara ignored him. Her attention was solely on her patient. She saw the recognition in Croft's eyes, a flicker from a past she had tried to bury, and for a fleeting moment the wolf inside her stirred. A cold dread, colder than any fear she felt in the face of death, washed over her. Her anonymity was her sanctuary, and it was about to be breached. "His pressure is labile, likely from the blood loss and shock," she stated calmly, her voice a steady anchor in the suddenly tense room. "We need to get this dressing off and assess the damage to the brachial plexus. Page Dr. Alistair, the head of vascular surgery." Now. Her tone was no longer that of a subordinate. It was a command, crisp and absolute, born of an authority that had nothing to do with a hospital hierarchy. The resident, startled by her sudden decisiveness, nodded dumbly and rushed to the intercom. Davies, however, was incensed by her usurpation of authority. "How dare you give orders in my hospital?" he hissed, stepping closer. "You are a nurse. You will do as you are told. Your job is to follow Dr. Ramirez's lead, not issue decrees. I've had enough of your insubordination. Consider this your final warning, Vance. One more misstep, and you will be cleaning out your locker." His threat was low and personal, a power play in the middle of a medical crisis. He was making it clear that her job was hanging by a thread he held in his manicured hand. The injustice of it was galling, but Ilara's focus was already elsewhere. The Admiral's recognition was a complication, but the immediate threat was the bullet in his shoulder. The rest was just noise. Before Ilara could respond, before Davies could escalate his tantrum, the entire hospital was plunged into an eerie silence. The frantic beeping of monitors, the distant wail of sirens, the hum of the ventilation system. It all ceased in an instant. A heavy, expectant quiet fell over the ER, followed a second later by the clunk and hum of the backup generators kicking in. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors in a hellish, pulsing glow. A collective gasp went through the staff. This was not a standard power outage. This was different. This was deliberate. Then the lockdown alarms blared, a deafening, repetitive klaxon that signaled a total facility shutdown. Heavy metal shutters slammed down over the windows and entrances with a series of concussive bangs, sealing the ER off from the outside world like a tomb. Panic, real and uncontained, began to bubble up among the staff and the walking wounded. Mr. Davies's face went white with terror. "What's happening? Someone tell me what is happening." he shrieked, his composure shattering into a million pieces. Through the din, Ilara heard a new sound, a sound that resonated deep in her bones, a sound from her other life, the methodical, rhythmic clack of military-grade boots on linoleum. It was the sound of disciplined, armed men moving with purpose. From the main ambulance bay, a team of 6 men emerged. They were not police. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. Their weapons, short-barreled rifles held at a low ready, were professional and deadly. They moved with a chilling efficiency, fanning out to secure the room, their movements economical and practiced. One of them raised his rifle and fired a single deafening shot into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down. "Nobody moves! Everyone on the floor, now!" the leader shouted, his voice electronically distorted by a modulator. "Hands on your head! Now!" The order was followed by the terrified scrambles of doctors, nurses, and patients. Mr. Davies dropped to his knees, whimpering, his expensive suit forgotten. The leader, a tall man whose cold, blue eyes were visible through the slit in his mask, scanned the room. His call sign was Kane. He was a professional, a mercenary of the highest caliber, and he was here on a contract. His eyes swept over the cowering hospital staff, dismissing them as irrelevant obstacles. His mission was simple: extract the asset, Admiral Jonathan Croft. Dead or alive, though alive was preferred and paid a premium. Kane's gaze settled on Trauma Bay 3, where the Admiral lay. He gestured to 2 of his men. "Secure the package. The rest of you maintain perimeter. No heroes." One of the hospital's own security guards, a burly former Marine named Sergeant Frank Miller, made a fatal error in judgment. Believing it was his duty, he drew his sidearm, a standard-issue pistol that looked like a child's toy against the mercenaries' assault rifles. "Drop your weapons. You are under—" Kane did not hesitate. He swiveled, his rifle coming up in a smooth, practiced arc. 2 rounds, a controlled double tap, slammed into Miller's chest. The sound was like a hammer striking concrete. Miller was thrown backward, his pistol clattering to the floor as he collapsed in a heap, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his uniform. A collective scream of horror went through the room. The moment stretched, suspended in the red emergency light. The wolf inside Ilara Vance, so long dormant, awoke. It was not a gradual rousing, it was a violent, instantaneous surge. The years of forced calm, of quiet anonymity, of pretending to be a sheep, were incinerated in a blast of pure, cold fury. The nurse was gone. Her eyes, which had been a placid grey, hardened into chips of slate. Her entire posture changed. The soft, unassuming lines of her body tightened into coiled springs of lethal potential. She saw the scene not as a terrified nurse, but as a tactical problem. 6 hostiles. Primary objective, protect the principal, Croft. Secondary objective, neutralize immediate threats. Opportunity, the chaos of the moment. She glanced at the defibrillator cart next to her, at the stainless steel tray of surgical instruments, at the 2 mercenaries now advancing on her bay. They saw a frightened nurse, cornered and helpless. They had no idea they were walking toward the deadliest thing in the room. As the first mercenary entered the bay, his rifle pointed at her, he sneered through his mask. "Get away from him, nurse." Ilara did not move back. She moved forward. In a motion too fast to be properly seen, she grabbed the heavy defibrillator paddles from their holsters. She did not charge them. She swung the right paddle in a vicious, horizontal arc, the hard plastic and metal edge connecting with the man's temple with a sickening crack. He dropped without a sound, his helmet doing little to absorb the focused, kinetic energy of the blow. Before his partner could even register what had happened, Ilara was on him. She used the dropped man's body as a shield and a ramp, lunging over him. She brought the second paddle up in a brutal uppercut to his jaw, snapping his head back. As he staggered, she dropped the paddle and her hand darted to the surgical tray. She palmed a scalpel, its blade gleaming in the red light. Her movement was not a slash, it was a precise anatomical strike, severing the carotid artery and jugular vein in a single fluid motion. The man gurgled, clutching at his throat as his life sprayed out in a hot, crimson torrent. He collapsed on top of his partner. Silence. A stunned, absolute silence descended upon the ER. The remaining mercenaries froze, their professional cool shattered by the sheer, brutal efficiency of what they had just witnessed. Mr. Davies stared, his mouth agape, a thin line of drool tracing a path down his chin. The other nurses and doctors were paralyzed with a mixture of terror and awe. Sergeant Miller, bleeding on the floor but still conscious, watched with the wide, respectful eyes of a professional, recognizing a master of his craft. And in the bed, Admiral Croft, weak as he was, managed a faint, grim smile. He knew. Of course, he knew. Ilara did not pause to admire her work. She immediately stripped the first mercenary of his rifle, a compact HK-416, and checked the magazine and chamber with practiced familiarity. She slung it over her shoulder. She grabbed his radio from his vest. "Kane, this is 2. Target is secured. No, wait. Contact." His dying gurgle was the last thing he transmitted. Kane's voice crackled back, tight with anger. 2, report! What is your status?" Ilara clicked the radio's transmit button twice, a simple, prearranged signal that often meant, "all clear." It was a gamble, but it might buy her a few precious seconds. She then turned her attention to Sergeant Miller. She moved to his side, ignoring the weapons of the remaining 4 mercenaries, who were still processing the impossible event. "Stay with me, Sergeant," she said, her voice low and urgent. She ripped open his shirt. 2 rounds, close grouping, high in the chest. His body armor had stopped them, but the back-face deformation had shattered his ribs and likely bruised his heart and lungs. He was in agony, fighting for breath. "Internal bleeding. Possible cardiac tamponade," she diagnosed, her hands already working, assessing the damage by touch. "I can help you, but you have to listen to me." Miller, gritting his teeth against the pain, just nodded, his eyes locked on her face with unwavering trust. Kane was no fool. The garbled transmission and subsequent silence told him everything he needed to know. "All units, converge on Bay 3. Hostile presence, I repeat. Hostile presence. Lethal force authorized." The remaining 3 mercenaries, plus Kane himself, began to advance cautiously, their initial shock replaced by a cold, professional anger. They had been made to look like amateurs by a single, unknown variable. A nurse. It was an insult that could only be answered with overwhelming force. Ilara knew she had seconds. She looked at Miller. "Can you shoot?" she asked, her voice flat. He coughed, a spray of pink foam on his lips. "Like breathing, ma'am?" She pulled the mercenary's sidearm from its holster and pressed it into his hand. "Good. Don't fire until I tell you. Aim for the head. They'll have plates." She then turned her attention to the bay. She shoved a heavy supply cart across the entrance, creating a makeshift barricade. She glanced at Admiral Croft, who was watching her with a look of immense pride and deep-seated pain. "Just stay down, sir," she said, the honorific slipping out naturally from a place she thought she had sealed away. The mercenaries reached the entrance to Bay 3. "In the room. Now," Kane ordered. The first man through the door was met not with a bullet, but with a canister of liquid oxygen Ilara had opened and rolled across the floor. The hissing cloud of supercooled gas hit him like a physical blow, flash freezing his visor and exposed skin. He screamed, a muffled, horrifying sound as he stumbled back blindly. "Now, Sergeant!" Ilara yelled. From his position on the floor, Miller fired twice. 2 clean shots. The blinded mercenary dropped. 3 hostiles left. Kane realized he was not dealing with a lucky amateur. This was a professional. Someone with training. Someone who knew how to turn a hospital into a kill zone. "Grenade!" he yelled, pulling a flashbang from his vest. Ilara heard the shout and reacted instantly. She didn't try to run or hide. She grabbed a heavy, lead-lined X-ray apron and threw it over herself and Admiral Croft, just as the grenade exploded with a blinding flash and a deafening bang. For a few seconds, the world was white light and ringing silence. Through the ringing in her ears, Ilara heard them coming. She rose from behind the gurney, the HK-416 in her hands. She did not spray and pray. She fired in short, controlled bursts. One of the mercenaries, disoriented by his own flashbang, staggered into her line of sight. A 3-round burst took him down. Now it was just her and Kane. He was smart, using the chaos to flank her, coming around the other side of the central console. She caught the movement in her peripheral vision. They saw each other at the same time. The final showdown was not a prolonged firefight. It was a brutal, close-quarters ballet. Kane was strong and fast, but Ilara was faster, her movements more precise. He lunged, trying to use his size to overwhelm her. She sidestepped, using his momentum against him, and drove the butt of her rifle into his kidney. He grunted in pain, but spun, lashing out with a combat knife. She parried the strike with the rifle's barrel, the sound of steel on steel ringing through the bay. For a few seconds they were locked in a desperate struggle, a contest of strength and will. Kane was stronger, and he was slowly forcing the point of his knife toward her throat. His cold blue eyes stared into hers. "Who are you?" he growled, the question a mix of fury and genuine curiosity. Ilara didn't answer with words. She suddenly relaxed the pressure, then slammed her forehead into the bridge of his nose. There was a wet, crunching sound. Kane roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted the rifle, trapping his knife hand, and fired a single round into the floor. The muzzle flash and deafening report right next to his head disoriented him completely. In that moment of stunned paralysis, she drove the barrel of the rifle up under his chin and pulled the trigger. The fight was over. A profound silence filled the ER, broken only by the whimpering of Mr. Davies and the ragged breathing of Sergeant Miller. Ilara stood in the center of the carnage, the rifle held loosely at her side, her chest heaving. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind the familiar, bone-deep weariness. The wolf was retreating, leaving the quiet nurse to survey the wreckage. She looked at the bodies of the men she had killed and felt nothing but a hollow ache. Just then, a new sound echoed from outside the sealed entrance, the high-pitched whine of a plasma torch cutting through the metal shutters. Moments later, the heavy door was thrown open, and a team of soldiers in full combat gear swarmed in, their weapons scanning the room. They were not police. SWAT. Their gear was too advanced, their movements too fluid. They were Tier 1. Behind them, a man strode into the emergency room as if he owned it. He was in his late 60s, wearing a crisply pressed army uniform adorned with 4 stars on each shoulder. His face was a granite mask of authority, and he moved with a purpose that dwarfed even Admiral Croft's earlier arrogance. This was General Marcus Thorne, commander of Joint Special Operations Command. Thorne's eyes swept the scene. The dead mercenaries, the cowering administrator, the wounded security guard, the stunned medical staff. His gaze finally settled on Ilara, standing amidst the debris, still holding the rifle. The hard lines of his face softened with a look of immense relief and profound respect. He ignored everyone else. He walked directly toward her, his boots crunching on shattered glass. The entire room held its breath. This powerful, intimidating man stopped a few feet from her. He did not yell. He did not question. He simply looked at her, then at the captured radio in her hand. In a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of absolute command, a voice that filled the entire ER, he spoke into his own radio. "Watchtower to all units. Valkyrie is secure. I repeat, Valkyrie is secure. Stand down." The call sign hung in the air, an impossible, alien word in this civilian world. Valkyrie. The soldiers visibly relaxed. Mr. Davies looked up, his face a mask of confusion. "Valkyrie?" He looked at the blood-spattered nurse, this quiet, insubordinate woman he had threatened to fire. It made no sense. General Thorne turned his attention back to Ilara. "It's been a long time, Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice softer now, for her alone. He gently took the rifle from her hands. "You look tired." Ilara gave a slow, weary nod, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her feeling hollowed out. "They hurt one of mine, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper, gesturing with her head toward Sergeant Miller. "He's a good man." Thorne nodded, his expression grim. "He's in good hands now." He signaled to two of his own medics, who immediately rushed to Miller's side with equipment that made the hospital's gear look archaic. It was then that Mr. Davies found his voice. Scrambling to his feet, he tried to reassert his shattered authority. "General, I am Gerald Davies, the administrator of this hospital. I demand to know what is going on. These animals attacked my facility, and this nurse." He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. She killed them. She went berserk. She must be arrested." General Thorne turned his head slowly to look at Davies. The look in his eyes was so cold, so filled with contempt, that Davies physically recoiled. Thorne didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet fury was more terrifying than any shout. "You are the administrator," he stated, the words dripping with ice. "Then you are the one who failed to protect the people in this room. You are the one who allowed this to happen on your watch." He took a step closer to the trembling bureaucrat. "And you are the one who threatened the single most valuable asset in this building." Thorne turned to face the assembled crowd of doctors, nurses, and his own soldiers. He gestured toward Ilara, who stood silently, her face pale. "You see this nurse?" he began, his voice now booming, a declarative pronouncement for all to hear. "You see this quiet, unassuming woman you work with every day? Let me tell you who you have been working alongside." He paused for dramatic effect. "This is former Staff Sergeant Ilara Vance, decorated Special Operations Combat Medic. Call sign, Valkyrie. She is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 4 Purple Hearts. She is, without exaggeration, a living legend." A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the onlookers. They stared at Ilara, at her simple scrubs, her tired face, and tried to reconcile that image with the general's words. Thorne continued, his voice resonating with history and suppressed rage. 8 years ago in the Kandahar Valley, a helicopter carrying a high-value command element was shot down deep in hostile territory. That element included a 2-star Admiral. He glanced meaningfully toward the gurney where Admiral Croft lay, watching, listening. The rescue team was hours away. A 5-man kill team of enemy insurgents was on site in minutes. The only friendly left standing between that kill team and the wounded, helpless command crew was a 24-year-old medic with a rifle and 3 spare magazines. That medic was Sergeant Vance. For 17 hours, Thorne's voice grew louder, filled with a raw, visceral pride. For 17 hours, she held them off. Alone. She repositioned the wounded, set up a defensive perimeter, and fought off wave after wave of attacks. When she ran out of ammunition for her rifle, she used the enemy's. When she was wounded, she stitched herself up and kept fighting. The scar on her temple, he pointed directly at Ilara's face, is not from a fender bender. It is from a piece of shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade that she took when she threw her own body over Admiral Croft to shield him from the blast. When my rangers finally reached the crash site, we found her, collapsed from blood loss, surrounded by the bodies of 13 enemy fighters, but with all 3 of her patients still alive. The ER was tomb silent. The story was so immense, so cinematic it seemed impossible, but the General's unwavering gaze and the Admiral's solemn nod confirmed it all. The quiet nurse, the woman they knew for her calm efficiency, was a giant, a hero of a scale they could barely comprehend. Thorne's gaze fell once more upon Davies, and it was like a physical blow. This woman, who has sacrificed more for her country than you can possibly imagine, chose to leave that world behind to find some measure of peace, to continue to heal people but without the bullets. She came here for quiet. And you, he sneered, you, in your infinite arrogance, threatened her job. You belittled her. You called her insignificant. Thorne pulled out his satellite phone. He made a call. It was brief. Yes, it's me. I have a situation here at Mercy General. The administrator, a man named Gerald Davies. Yes, that's him. Obstruction of a federal operation, reckless endangerment of a national asset, and criminal negligence. Yes, I'll hold. He looked at Davies, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure terror. They'll be here in 5 minutes to take you into federal custody. Your board of directors has already been notified. Your career is over. Your assets will be frozen pending an investigation into your security contracts, which I suspect will be found to be criminally inadequate. You will be lucky if you are not bankrupted and imprisoned for the next 20 years. The downfall was swift, total, and brutally public. Davies sank to his knees, a broken man, his world utterly destroyed in the space of 2 minutes by a man who wielded power he could not even conceive of. The catharsis in the room was palpable. A deep, satisfying justice had been served. As federal agents arrived to haul the sobbing Davies away, a sound began. It was soft at first. Sergeant Miller, propped up by one of Thorne's medics, began to clap, his hands moving weakly but with clear intent. Then another nurse joined in, then a doctor, and then the entire room, including Thorne's own soldiers, erupted in thunderous applause. It was for her, for the quiet hero who walked among them, unrecognized. Ilara looked up, her grey eyes shimmering with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming release. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. General Thorne walked back to her side. "It's time to come home, Valkyrie," he said gently. "Your country still needs you. We can give you a new role. Instructor, consultant, away from the front lines. But you belong with us." Ilara looked around the ER, at the faces of her colleagues, at the wounded but safe Sergeant Miller, at the sleeping form of Admiral Croft. Her time here, her quest for anonymity, was over. The wolf had been roused, and it could not be put back in its cage. She gave a single, slow nod. "Okay, sir," she whispered. "I'm ready." As she was escorted out by the general, leaving behind a scene of carnage and awe, she passed Sergeant Miller. She paused and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Sergeant," she said. He looked up at her, his face etched with pain and reverence. "No, ma'am," he breathed. "You did." She offered him a small, genuine smile. a rare and beautiful thing, before turning and walking out of the emergency room and back into the world she had tried so desperately to leave behind. Her stride was no longer the quiet shuffle of a nurse. It was the steady, purposeful walk of a warrior, her place in the world, once hidden, now irrevocably reclaimed. The story of what happened that night at Mercy General would become a legend, a cautionary tale to the arrogant and an inspiration to the humble, a stark reminder that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens, and that true heroes are not defined by the noise they make, but by the scars they have earned in silence.